Okay, the recess is soon coming to a close, so would all witnesses please come back to the table and turn their cameras on.
Call the Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security Subcommittee to order on the topic of the rise of terrorism, domestic terrorism in America. Very pleased to yield to the distinguished chairman of the full committee, Mr. Nadler of New York, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Henderson, the Biden administration will soon have a new attorney general. What advice would you give him to deal with domestic terrorists more effectively, and in particular, white supremacist violence?
Well, thank you, Chairman Nadler, for the question. We have asked the Attorney General to pursue making the attention to extremism one of the top issues of his tenure as Attorney General. He has announced his intent to do that. Secondly, we have asked him to explore processes to address the problem of extremism in law enforcement. As you know, there were a number of law enforcement officials who were identified as part of the group of insurrectionists that struck the Capitol on January 6th. We hope that the Attorney General will pursue that suggestion in a vigorous way, similar to what Lloyd Austin has announced for the Department of Defense. Thirdly, we have asked that resources to address hate crime violence and appropriations be requested by the department, that they make more of an issue of this than has been done. And we think the Attorney General will do that. I'm quite confident that from the announcement that Attorney General-elect Garland has made, he intends to make addressing white nationalism and extremism, hate crime violence, a major provision of his administration. And I think that will be a very good step to take.
Well, thank you. Now, Mr. German, even if you believe a new domestic terrorism statute isn't necessary, and that the Justice Department has other legal authorities to address white supremacist and far-right militant violence, can you explain the harms in providing the FBI and federal prosecutors with one more tool to address domestic terrorism?
Thank you for the question. I think there are two harms. The first is that these new authorities would be used as their current authorities are used, abusively to target groups that are not engaged in criminal violence to the nature that white supremacist groups are. And the second is that it misdiagnoses the problem. The problem is not a lack of authority. It's a long-standing problem of policy and practice within the FBI and within the Justice Department to deprioritize these crimes. And until we change that, the way that these institutions look at this issue, we won't actually, even if more laws are passed, won't actually be attacking the problem.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Nance, what role do international white supremacy and extremism organizations play in influencing American domestic terrorism?
You know, there are many groups, as we saw in the run-up to the Charlottesville protests. There was a lot of international coordination between the disparate groups that created the Unite the Right movement and some that were operating principally in Germany, Pegida, which is an anti-immigrant organization, fascist-based group, which actually has very deep ties to United Russia, the Nashi. The New Dawn organization, another right-wing fascist group from Greece. You know, they have all of these networks that operate throughout Europe, and they were using an actual game communication platform to help coordinate. One of the things that we mistook about the Charlottesville protest, or that led to the riots there and the fighting there, is that this was not sort of an end state of the American, alt-right, or as they call themselves, the neo-Nazis, these neo-Confederates. It was a coming out party. It was where they were actually coming together to show themselves as a unified force under a white supremacist banner, bringing together all of these disparate groups. They do have international support. Some of the people you wouldn't imagine. David Duke had an apartment in Moscow. Richard Spencer, the head of the neo-Nazis, his wife was the chief translator for Alexander Dugin, Vladimir Putin's ideological philosopher. She is an ethnic pro-Moscow Ukrainian. They have ties, and these are things that we're going to have to see because their message, even today, is being amplified by foreign powers.
Thank you. And do you agree with what Mr. Henderson and Mr. German said?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely agree with everything they said, particularly Mr. German's comments. You know, one of the problems that we have with designating domestic violent extremists as terrorists isn't so much a question of the laws. It's how the laws can be focused so that it really goes after terrorists and not people who are carrying out civil unrest or civil disobedience. I mean, in some definitions, based on what Mr. Ngo said today, we would have to have, arrested just about everyone who, violently protested at it or violently rioted at a Super Bowl party or a state championship. The definition needs to meet the tactics. Do the tactics involve explosive bombings? Timothy McVeigh was not charged with domestic terrorism. He was charged with use of a weapon of mass destruction and 186 counts of murder. We may need to focus that a bit more.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now yield to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. and I thank you for the opportunity today. Today, in a hearing entitled The Rise of Domestic Terrorism in America, all I have heard from the Democrats on this committee and from their witnesses is white supremacy and far-right extremism, while completely ignoring the riots, destruction, and violence of Antifa and BLM we saw all last year and that continues. All forms of domestic terrorism are criminal, but in order to properly address the threats, we need to talk about all types of domestic terrorism, including Antifa and BLM. The Democrats have chosen to either ignore, condone, or even embrace this violence from Antifa and Black Lives Matter. The Democratic majority and Democratic members of this committee have downplayed Antifa's violence and status as domestic terrorist organizations. They have claimed that Antifa keeps, quote, protesters safe when a lot of other folks won't, and stated that Antifa is, quote, false issue and, quote, a myth. The term domestic terrorism is defined in federal law as, quote, involving acts dangerous to human life that are in violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state and appear to be intended to intimidate, coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. At this time, I'd like to play a video. Please don't tell me what to do. Thank you. Mr. Henderson, after watching that video and listening to the reading of my definition under federal law of what domestic terrorism is, I ask you, do you believe that what you saw in that video meets the elements of domestic terrorism? Yes or no?
I will respond simply by saying we can all condemn violence.
I'm asking you to answer the question, yes or no.
I will not. No, I will not answer it yes or no.
Okay, well, I'll take that as a no. Mr. German, this is my time. Mr. German, Mr. German, the video that you just watched, do you define that? Would you call that domestic terrorism, yes or no?
Again, unless it's
very easy. You just watched the video of what occurred. Yes or no? Do you determine that under the federal law of domestic terrorism? Yes or no? Yes or no?
That's the problem. You're showing a piece of video.
I'll give Mr. Nance.
The gentleman is not allowing the witness to answer the question.
No, I gave a question which is yes or no. That's how they can answer. Mr. Nance, yes or no? You're on mute.
No, it's civil disobedience. We have codes for that.
So that's civil disobedience.
Ever
burning down, creating $80 billion worth of damage across our country. That's civil disobedience, but what occurred here on January 6th was domestic terrorism. I yield back.
That was instruction.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Missouri is recognized, Ms. Bush, for 5 minutes.
St. Louis, and I thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this timely hearing. I first want to start by addressing some of what has been said. It's easy for us to talk about protests from the lofty halls of Congress, but I want to talk about these realities from my own experience as an activist on the front lines. I spent more than 400 days in the streets of Ferguson. And, during that time, while a lot of you all speaking, were nestled sweetly in your beds, looking and reading articles and looking at pictures and videos, and you have actually no clue what really was happening on the ground, what actually happens in protests. And I'm just trying to think if I ever saw any of your faces show up for Black Lives on the streets of Ferguson. I don't remember seeing your faces. And we were out there for more than 400 days fighting for Black lives. And so while you're putting your mouth on people, where were you? I'm one of those Black Lives Matter activists you're talking about. I saw Oath Keepers enter our neighborhood heavily armed. They came equipped with military-grade weaponry. These militias were on buildings in sniper gear. Their presence was a threat. I'm also aware of Defenders for Black Life, for people of all walks of life uniting for justice. We cannot equate white nationalist violence with what my colleagues on the right stated as left-wing extremist violence. Equating a righteous movement for justice with hateful and racist white nationalism is outright ignorant and disingenuous on your part. But for white supremacy, in which you benefit, we would not be in the streets demanding to be heard. We're demanding to be heard to save lives. And let me say this, had you fixed it before now, we wouldn't be here. And there are not fine people on both sides. There is simply no comparison. White supremacy is deeply entrenched in our nation's DNA, so much so that we have a wealth of history to rely on as we respond to this latest iteration of violence. Here are the facts as I see them. White nationalist groups have infiltrated federal and local law enforcement agencies. And I can say that because I know, because the protesters that I rock with, the protesters I'm with, we have gone out and pulled those undercover officers, those folks that were infiltrating the protest movement, causing destruction. We pulled them out and we gave them back to their police. As a matter of fact, you can look up an officer who just won $5 million because he was beaten because they thought that he was actually a protester and he was really an undercover cop. So, but don't take my word for it. You can read the leaked FBI Counterterrorism Division memo if you need some more information. By expanding the legal authority of law enforcement agencies without addressing the infiltration of white supremacy within law enforcement, we are expanding the capacity of white supremacy itself. It is no wonder then that domestic terrorism laws have historically targeted Black freedom fighters, indigenous environmentalists, and immigration activists. Just last week, on the anniversary of his assassination, we mourned the loss of Malcolm X, a human rights activist who was surveilled and criminalized while fighting for justice and Black liberation. Had we had our liberation, he wouldn't have had to fight. And it is because of this treatment that I am committed to holding white supremacists accountable and forcing my colleagues and our country to reckon with our violent history. So, Mr. German, you've argued that the Justice Department and FBI's failure to properly address white supremacist militant violence is not from a lack of legal authority, but a matter of policy and practice. Why are those policies and practices as they exist not targeting white supremacy?
I think that there's a multifaceted answer to that, but part of the problem is that the FBI remains a mostly white organization, and that in structural racism, I think, is still a problem within the FBI. So when those agents go home at night, they don't look out on the horizon and see a threat to their families from white supremacy.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Mr. German. Our reliance on the police state is entirely misplaced. Federal law enforcement officers already have the legal authority to go after white supremacy. So, Mr. Henderson, How can we hold white supremacy accountable without expanding the legal authority?
We have, thank you for your question. We have many statutes on the books, over 50 terrorism-related statutes that can be used to prosecute individuals who are engaged in violent activity. We do not need another statute to simply be used as justification for moving against those who do harm to our country. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, and I yield my time.
That document into the record. The FBI document that you held up regarding BLM. Do you want to enter it into the record?
Yes.
Without objection. So ordered. Thank you. Let me now yield to Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this very important hearing, and thank you to our extraordinary witnesses. What is not viewed as white nationalists have existed since the founding of this country, and only gotten worse in recent years. And in fact, the Assistant Director for Counterterrorism at the FBI stated, and I quote, "Racially motivated violent extremists are responsible for the majority of lethal attacks and fatalities perpetrated by domestic terrorists since 2000, end quote. A sentiment echoed by the FBI director as well. So this is a fact. This is a serious problem facing our country. And my first question, Mr. Chairman, is for you. In most states, people who have been convicted of a violent hate crime would still pass a background check to purchase a firearm because federal law currently prohibits only individuals convicted of felonies from possessing firearms. I'm going to be reintroducing the Disarm Hate Act, which would close this loophole so that people convicted of a misdemeanor hate crime, including a misdemeanor assault hate crime, would be prohibited from purchasing and possessing firearms. And I just wondered if you would speak to the relationship between firearms and domestic violent extremists, and how keeping guns out of the hands of violent white supremacists before they're able to engage in deadly violence is a key strategy to respond to this pandemic.
Thank you for the question. Yes, illegal firearms transactions are one of the primary ways that these militant groups obtain weapons. So enforcing the federal firearms laws is an effective way to address their crimes.
Thank you. And Mr. Nance, I'd like to ask you what role that social media has played in the resurgence of extremists and white nationalists, and in particularly in radicalizing violent extremists and in weaponizing them against or to target minorities. Kind of what has been the role of social media? And if you could tell social media companies to do 3 things to reduce the spread of domestic terrorism and white supremacist propaganda, what would that be?
Well, first, it's been an explosion since the rise of social media. Even as far back as 10 years ago, people had to communicate through very hard methodologies. If some of you recall, back in the 1960s, there was a group called the John Birch Society. If you wanted to hear any of their crazy rantings, you literally had to receive a mimeographed copy mailed to your house or find it on a street corner. The same thing with the rise of militia groups in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, any one individual can have the communications power of the New York Times to spread any method of violence. The one thing that's happening right now is the deplatforming of many of these groups. And I know it upsets our conservative members of this committee to understand that private companies do not need the legal liability of allowing people to advocate hate, death, and destruction. They can deplatform anyone, including leftist groups or whichever groups, so long as they remain within the terms of service. What's going on, and I monitor it every day. I read their Telegram channels, Parler, Instagram, whatever. They actually plot terror on these channels. What we need to do by deplatforming them, they still have their freedom of speech. They can say anything they want. They just don't have the right to go out and coordinate acts of domestic violence or threatening violence using private platforms. They want to create their own, allow us to channel that, streamline our intelligence collection against them. Awesome. But they don't have the right to use civilian private companies' platforms. And deplatforming is exactly what we did to ISIS and Al Qaeda. That's precisely what needs to happen to these militia groups and terrorists.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Henderson, it's great to see you. We know that white supremacists and far-right domestic extremists are the most significant domestic terrorist threat to our country. How does Congress best ensure that resources are properly allocated to address the immediate and real danger these white supremacy groups pose to our domestic security, while also ensuring that the same authority is not later used to disproportionately target communities of color?
It's a great question, Mr. Cicilline. I think we follow the data. I know that both the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have designated white supremacy and extremism as the #1 national security threat facing our country from internal sources. We need to provide resources to those agencies to address the problem as they have outlined it in their research and findings. The fact that we oppose, that is the broad civil rights community, the creation of a new domestic terrorism statute is based on the fact that we know it will be used against the very communities that are most vulnerable now to that extremism. And we're deeply concerned about it.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Fired. And Mr. Liu. Mr. Liu is recognized for 5 minutes. The gentleman from California.
Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, for holding this important hearing. I condemn all political violence. I'm pleased that my Republican colleagues can say that same sentence, but their words ring hollow if they can't say this following simple, truthful statement: the election was not stolen. Because it's that big lie that fueled the rage that caused domestic terrorists to attack our Capitol on January 6th. It is that same big lie that results in National Guard troops still being deployed outside our Capitol in body armor. I hope my Republican colleagues will tell the truth and reduce the risk of further political violence. I also note that at the beginning of this hearing, the Republicans played a video of the former president saying that there were very fine people on both sides in Charlottesville. I found that video deeply offensive. And the reason is because if you attended that rally of white supremacists and participated, you are no longer a very fine person. I don't care if you love puppies or if you give to charities. If you go participate in a rally where people are holding Nazi flags, wearing swastikas, and waving Confederate flags, you are no longer a very fine person. And it is wrong for my Republican colleagues to somehow whitewash that statement. The former president was wrong then, he is wrong now. It's that same false equivalence that we see again today in other aspects of this hearing. We know in domestic terrorists, if we look at the data, that white supremacist groups simply are far more lethal. You don't have to trust me, you can trust Ken Cuccinelli, the former acting deputy director of the Department of Homeland Security, who basically said, if you look at the data, per people incidents of violence, white supremacist groups are far more lethal. Chad Wolf, the former acting Secretary of Homeland Security, basically said the same exact thing. And then Christopher Wray, the FBI director, also said that when you look at extremist motivated domestic terrorist incidents, it is the white supremacist ideology that forms the largest portion of that. So stop with the false equivalences. There is one group or groups, it's white supremacist ideology that's causing the major problems across America. And unfortunately, we've seen the former president use statements such as, there are very fine people on both sides. He told the Proud Boys to stand by. He uses racist phrases like Kung Flu that's resulted in increased attacks against Asian Americans during this pandemic. And so my question is to Mr. Nance. What happens when the leader of the free world uses racist phrases? Does that give these white supremacist groups more license to go do their violent acts?
Well, absolutely. And it's very simple reason why. Because, you know, a lot of people like to say that what we're seeing here is in the white supremacist movement is really an act of, patriotism or politics. No, this is tribalism at its rawest form. President Trump pretty much promised, in nebulous terms, of course, that he was their tribal leader and that he would not allow, for the e pluribus unum component of our government from many one to take place. He was really promising unum tribus dominus. One tribe will dominate the rest. He led for only 45% of the country and almost ignored 65% of the country. They think he is their lord. They, in groups that support him, they actually refer to him as God Emperor of the United States. I wish I was making that up, but that's true. They view him as a person befitting of being the first dictator of the United States. One of the reasons why we have a lot of heartburn with what happened with the insurrection on the Capitol and why it is not equivalent to the protest in Portland or Black Lives Matter, which was civil disturbance, was the fact that they came to overthrow the government and to install a president as a monarch, as a dictator. That is the difference here. It has never happened in American history. Even the South attempted to use the tenets of the Constitution for secession, not here. So they believe they're tribal chieftain.
Thank you. I also note that in the last 4 years, we've seen a disturbing rise in anti-Semitic attacks and attacks in the Jewish American community. So I'll just close, Mr. Henderson, if you could give your thoughts on how we can start mitigating those attacks.
The gentleman's time has expired. I'll let the gentleman answer just very briefly, please. The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Anti-Semitism is a huge problem in this country and globally, and we need to address it as we address other serious hate crime activity. I hope the Department of Justice will explore expanding its hate crime related education programs and enforcement. I think that's the best way to address anti-Semitism.
I thank the gentleman very much. The time has expired of Mr. Liu, and I'm delighted to recognize Ms. Sparks, the gentlelady from Indiana, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a quick couple questions. I first wanted to make a quick comment. It's important discussions what we have, but we also want to make sure that we also have a freedom of people to exercise their First Amendment rights and the rights of protest, of peaceful protest. We have to be careful when we create rules where some people might be just afraid to go to have for a peaceful protest to say something there because there could be some violent people out there. And I think it's important as part of a free society that our freedom for peaceful protest is not infringed. I know several of my constituents called me and they were very surprised when they had FBI calling their houses. They were not even here on January 6th. Some people showed up in their houses and people literally afraid. So I grew up in a very bad country with strong communist government and people were afraid to protest. So we can never forget that. But we want to make sure that we have a right framework, legal framework. If people truly create crimes, cause crimes, then they will be properly punished. So my question is for Mr. German. We're discussing about domestic terrorism, and a lot of this, a lot of things, people just really criminals and thugs that create harm. So we have a criminal code, and I'm not an attorney, so I'm a common person, right? But our laws should be written the way that common individuals should understand. So my first question is, there is anything in the code, any type of crimes that are not addressed by already crimes existing in the code? We have hate crimes, we have murders, we have people creating different type of violence and assault. So is there any type of crimes that are not there? Or if the crimes are there, but we want to have some enhanced penalties, potentially if there is some domestic terrorism, then it goes to the question, is our definition of domestic terrorism should be revisited, or you believe it really reflects what it needs to be? So I have 3 questions. Are there any crimes, about the penalties, and the third question about the definition?
Thank you very much for that question, and I'll try to keep them in order. Yes, there are plenty of crimes on the books that the domestic terrorism prosecutors at the Justice Department actually use. What our report looked at were the instances where these multitude of statutes were actually used in domestic terrorism prosecutions. So there are plenty of federal laws. Plus, the way that the Justice Department has established its counterterrorism program is through joint terrorism task forces, where they also take advantage of state and local laws. So if there was any gap because of the circumstances of a particular crime, state and local law enforcement prosecution could follow through. So there are more than enough laws on the books. And you're right, I want to make sure that law enforcement is focused on the violent acts and not on speech or attendance at a protest or association. With the white supremacist and far-right militant groups, there is a lot of violence these groups commit that falls through the cracks because the Justice Department's policy of deferring hate crimes to state and local investigators who may not have hate crime laws that can be effectively applied, or just treating it as violent crime, which is a local law enforcement problem rather than a federal problem, and therefore the data about those crimes isn't collected. So it's a matter of holding these agencies accountable, and we want to make sure that we have enough public accountability over the way the FBI uses these authorities to hold it responsible when it does use them to target people who are just expressing themselves or associating with people we might find odious.
So just to follow up, so what are the better, because a lot of enforcement tools are really in the local jurisdictions that exist. So what are kind of things you can have and ideas, because it's really a matter not of us really doing something with the code, but enforcement issues. Do you have some ideas to make sure people do enforce the law, because it's important for us for public safety? And we had that discussion this summer. A lot of mayors were not, a lot of businesses were destroyed and nothing was done. And then, a lot of mayors, they hire the police. It's a local jurisdiction issues. And we as a state even look what we can do as a state. I was a state senator. But what ideas do you have?
So number one, at many of those protests, there were literally hundreds of people arrested. So it's not as if there wasn't enforcement action being taken. It's just that what those prosecutions showed was that there was no organized effort to engage in those acts. So according to what the charges that were actually prosecuted. But to your question, again, these agencies work hand in glove with the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. There are law enforcement intelligence fusion centers that are supposed to be sharing this information, but too often they're focused on issues that don't have to do with actual acts of violence. And that's the problem, is there's so much false information and misinformation going through these networks that when a real warning passes through, it's not paid attention to because
Ladies, time is up. The witness wrap up his statement. Thank you very much. And let me be very clear, Ms. Bartz, that we are all committed to civil liberties and civil rights and to not have anyone's First Amendment rights violated. So thank you for your comments. I'm now pleased to yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you very much for holding this most important committee hearing, and the topic is very, very important. I remember 3 years ago after the Charlottesville, Virginia incident, hate crime incident, Heather Heyer was killed, 34 people were injured. I called on the House Homeland Security Committee to hold hearings on this growing threat. My words, my request fell on deaf ears, and I'm glad that Congress is finally figuring out these issues, the dangers of domestic terrorism and white nationalism. And I say this because I think back to my weekends at home on Main Street. I do a lot of work with our veterans. I go to the VFW American Legion halls. I look at our veterans, some that are dreamers that just came back from serving, our World War II veterans. And, these World War II veterans are looking at me and saying, we fought against Nazi Germany, against the swastika, and now I see them on TV. And they ask me, Lou, what are you doing? What's happening to our country? And I would propose to you this white supremacist, this hate, is a cancer on our nation. Why? Because our armed services today are so diverse. You have people from all over the world defending and serving our country. Just last year, we had a couple of Vietnamese Americans promoted to generals in our nation. And yesterday, I co-authored a resolution speaking out against recent increases in hate crimes against Asian Americans. We're a country made up of people from all over the world. This is why white nationalism, racism is a cancer in our society. And Mr. German, I'm going to ask you, 9/11, after 9/11, our focus of this country was against foreign terrorists. For almost 20 years, we looked the other way. We focused all our efforts on there, not here. We wake up today, and we've lost more lives now to domestic terrorism than to foreign terrorism. You said that the FBI has chosen not to prioritize domestic terrorism. January 6th, you said a complete intelligence failure. Silos in our backyards. We have our county governments, our local police departments operating in silos. Therefore, we don't have the data we need to paint a complete and accurate picture of domestic terrorism. Sir, Mr. German, what do we do? Where do we go from here? You keep saying we have the laws that we need to prosecute, to put a stop to white nationalism, to this kind of hate and hate crimes. Where do we go from here, sir?
Thank you very much for the question. I think first we have to get the data. Congress had passed the National Defense Authorization Act. This data is well overdue. And without data about how the FBI and the Justice Department are actually using
Does it take that long to get that data, or is there a systematic denial that that situation exists and therefore the data is not presented to us?
It's a systematic denial. In the case of the Justice Department prosecutions, the docket numbers are public information, but they take them off their prosecutive reports so that you can't match up a case they're claiming as a terrorism statistic to an actual case. With the FBI, yes, this is information that they have in their files that they could put out at any time, right? This is just basic data about how many investigations they open against these categories. So it's data that is easily available.
So, Mr. German, is it time that we police the FBI to be looking at independent research and data collection to get a solid picture of what's going on out there?
Absolutely. And whether it's through the Government Accountability Office or other means, if the FBI is refusing to provide data that Congress needs in order to serve its policymaking function, then Congress has robust tools to compel that information. And I think we have to get tough with these agencies now because
Mr. German, thank you very much. I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to say that I want to go back to Main Street, want to go meet with our veterans, both Democrats and Republicans, independents. And when they ask me, Lou, can you bring back the country I fought for, that I laid it all on the line for? I want to have a good answer for them. Thank you very much. And Madam Chair, I'm out of time. I yield.
I thank the gentleman from California, and we join him in wanting to tell those veterans that our America is back. With that, I want to yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I want to express my gratitude to you for having this very important hearing. I'd like to thank our panelists as well for being with us today. I also want to express my gratitude, Madam Chair, to you and Chairman Nadler for recognizing the attack on El Paso on August 3rd, 2019 in your opening remarks, and for understanding the pain and trauma that my community has gone through as a result of that horrific attack. My interest is in preventing the kind of pain and trauma my community is still enduring and ensuring that no other American community has to live through what we lived through, which was horrific violence at the hands of a domestic terrorist. And I think in order to do that, in order to prevent this from happening, we've got to understand, number one, the root causes that fuel the violence. Number two, the tools that are used by domestic terrorists in order to inflict that violence. When it comes to El Paso, we know what the root causes were. The root causes were anti-immigrant, racist, xenophobic hatred that the domestic terrorist confessed fueled his 10-hour drive to El Paso. He drove to my community because he confessed to wanting to slaughter Mexicans and immigrants. He published a screed online shortly before walking into that Walmart, and that screed used the same language, anti-immigrant, hateful, dehumanizing language that Donald Trump had used from the loudest bully pulpit in the world, from the office of the presidency. I wish I could say that with the election, we no longer have to deal with that kind of xenophobic, awful hate, but unfortunately, it is being invited back into Washington, D.C. My Republican colleagues have invited Stephen Miller, who is a white nationalist, to come brief them. They have also invited Mark Morgan, who is a member of a hate group, an anti-immigrant organization recognized as a hate group. He's being asked to brief them as well. And this is because we, on the House Democratic side, would like to pass immigration reform. And so unfortunately, while I wish I could say that the attack on El Paso had provided a lesson, a profound lesson against the use of anti-immigrant hate and a playbook rooted in xenophobia, I wish that a lesson had been learned. Unfortunately, it has not. And I would call on my colleagues to repudiate that hate and to disinvite Stephen Miller, Mark Morgan, Tom Homan, and others who perpetuate that hate. I would ask them to please rescind their invitations or to not show up. But in addition to understanding root causes, we've got to understand the tools. Mr. Henderson, Ms. Scanlon had asked you to talk about prevention, but she ran out of time. And so you were in the middle of talking to us about what we in Congress or we in the federal government can do to prevent more of these attacks. I'm going to ask you to finish your thoughts. And then, Mr. German, among the tools also are guns, frankly, and would love for you to comment quickly after Mr. Henderson finishes his thoughts on what background checks can do to help combat domestic terrorism. Mr. Henderson.
Ms. Escobar, thanks for the question. Our hearts go out to you and your constituents for their losses in August of 2019. I think one of the first things and one of the best things that can be done is for our country to really take an inward look at where we are and how we got there. There is a resolution under consideration in the House sponsored by Congresswoman Barbara Lee to establish a national commission on truth, racial healing, and transformation. I think that that would be one of the most important steps that might be undertaken to look at the totality of circumstances that brought us to the point today. I'll stop with that.
Thank you so much, Mr. German. Background checks.
So as I stated earlier, illegal weapons trafficking is one of the routine crimes that these organized militant groups engage in. So background checks are very helpful, both to identify people who are prohibited from owning weapons and prevent them from getting it, but also because it shows where these groups will go in order to obtain the weapons they want, but can't go through legitimate processes. So it's very effective.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Texas. Her time has expired. It's now my pleasure to yield to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. It's been a very interesting hearing. And the sad part of it is some people still don't recognize that we went through the most horrific experience that the United States of America has ever been the victim of from within, an attempt to overturn our Constitution and our government. And yes, while a majority, 57-43, felt Donald Trump incited that, in public opinion, that's pretty astonishing, including 7 Republicans. When he went out on the ellipse And he said, if you don't fight hard, you're not strong, you won't have a country. Mr. Henderson, you heard people in the 60s and 70s and whenever Ku Klux Klan's people encouraged their people to go and do violence. Did you take Mr. Trump's words, you won't have a country, to be racial in nature and to be a dog whistle?
I thought it was certainly a dog whistle, Mr. Cohen. I thought it was beyond a dog whistle. I thought it was a foghorn. I thought that the effort to inflame passions on January 6th that ultimately led to the insurrection at the Capitol, the failed coup d'etat, as I saw it, indeed had been inflamed by those words. And yes, I agree completely with your observations.
Mr. Nance, did that ever, I tell you, it didn't come to me until really I watched a couple of movies that were Chadwick Boseman, the Jackie Robinson and the Thurgood Marshall. And while they were movies, they depicted the society of the 40s and the hate and the enmity that white racist Southerners had towards integration, and troublemakers like Thurgood Marshall. Good troublemakers, but they weren't seen that way. And it hit me that that was racial when Trump said, you won't have a country. Mr. Nance, did you see that as well?
Yes, and it's disturbing mainly in the sense that the bully pulpit of the President of the United States was used as a cudgel, and a cudgel which was essentially handed off to a mob with near explicit instructions to go up and stop the constitutional process of certifying an election. This is why I took issue with what Mr. No said earlier. For whatever you want to say about what happened in Portland, in Seattle, in Kenosha, those were not acts of terrorism. They were not domestic terrorists. They were acts of civil disobedience and protest. We've seen equal vigor at Super Bowl protests. We've seen fire and fights, and I'm from Philadelphia. But what we saw on the 6th of January was literally an organized attempt, which was backed by 40,000 protesters and as many as 3,000 to 5,000, according to the Park Service's estimates, smashing in to destroy your building to stop the democratic process, to literally stop democracy in its tracks. They were willing to kill. As Officer Fanone said, when he was being beaten and his pistol belt was being grabbed, someone said, kill him with his own gun. It was only the fact that he begged them that he had children that protesters got in between them. They fully intended to commit this violence. They thought they were taking back a country from what it is. They don't believe in e pluribus unum. They really wanted to create their own imaginary state with Donald Trump as leader.
It was a sad, sad day, the saddest day in the history of our country, and some people aren't accepting it. Now, I want to say I didn't approve of some of the Antifa actions of coming to Washington and breaking windows and doing some of the things they did after Trump was inaugurated. And I said that, and some of the things, but that's not the issue. It doesn't compare. It's like comparing a forest fire to somebody with a match or setting it's just, there's no comparison. And the fact is, what we experienced was horrific, and people need to accept it and not try to defend it. Somebody here said there were only 200 people that went into the Capitol. That's absurd. There were way more than 200 policemen, and they were overrun. 200 people would not have overrun our Capitol Police. That's just false. And when we had hearings, I told the committee, try to say boogaloo. Can you say boogaloo? And nobody could say boogaloo. I went on the floor and I said, can anybody here say boogaloo? They couldn't say it. Their lips were locked. And yet it was boogaloo that killed the officer in Oakland, who they tried to claim was part of the unrest. And they even brought the
gentleman's time has expired.
The officer to Fort McHenry and make her look like it was somebody else. Get real. We've got to fight against the white extremists and make our country safe again. I yield back to Beth.
Gentleman's time has expired. very much to members. We have a few points that we'd like to clarify, and so I'm going to yield 5 minutes at this time to Mr. Biggs, the ranking member of the subcommittee. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. German, you wrote a book called Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide, How the New FBI Damages Democracy, right?
Yes.
And if I can, I haven't read your book, just read some summaries of it, but one of the things that it chronicles how the FBI transformed itself after 9/11 from a law enforcement agency famous for prosecuting organized crime and corruption to arguably the most secretive domestic intelligence agency the country has ever seen. Is that a fair, is that a fair statement?
It's accurate.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that premise. I'm actually, I don't know if I'm going to buy your book, but I might check it out in the library to read it because I agree with that premise. And that leads me to a couple of things that I think I'd like you and Mr. No to each respond to, if you would, please. Do you think the FBI has the necessary tools to investigate domestic terrorism while ensuring constitutional rights are protected, especially in light of the abuse of FISA authority, which we've seen over the last couple of years? So I'll go first to Mr. No, then to you, Mr. German. Mr. No.
Thank you for the question. I'm not an expert on FBI and federal capabilities to investigate, so I'll have to defer to my co-panelists for the answer. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Thank you. Mr. German.
So thank you very much for the question. Part of the problem after 9/11 was the reduction of criminal predicates. So after the Church Committee investigation, the Attorney General guidelines were issued to create a requirement that an agent have a reasonable indication based on articulable facts that the person they want to investigate is engaged in a federal crime or will engage in a federal crime. This is a very low standard. Most FBI agents I knew woke up pretty suspicious. The problem is removing those standards allow the FBI to investigate people not based on any evidence of wrongdoing, but rather based upon the agent's own bias or the agent's own belief that something might happen in the future. And that's a big part of the problem, both in the way the electronic surveillance authorities were changed with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and the Patriot Act, and with the way the Attorney General guidelines were changed. So if we can restore those criminal predicates, that will require the FBI agents to actually be working from articulable facts rather than bias.
Sure, and so with that, dozens of states from New York to Nevada have their own anti-terrorism laws. Can you comment on whether these state laws have been effective to investigate and prosecute domestic terrorism?
I haven't done any kind of comprehensive study of those. I am concerned about the use of terrorism in the law, in federal law as well as state and local law. The way we worked when I was undercover in the early 90s was we were investigating the criminal activities some of the people within these groups were engaged in, and that separated it from the ideology. And terrorism is a politicized term, so it's not surprising that when we talk about it, there's a political element to how we interpret it. So my advice is to focus on the violent crimes and the actual violations of the criminal statutes and not expand this use of terrorism. Learn the lessons from the inappropriate and harmful acts we took after 9/11 so we can actually work against people who are engaging in violence rather than focusing on what their ideologies may or may not be.
So my last question, and this is for you, Mr. German, because you said earlier you were focusing on groups, but 18 U.S.C. 2331(5), for instance, which defines domestic terrorism, it doesn't require that anybody have a conspiracy or any group. It just requires the elements of that crime be met. And there's three elements. I don't want to get in all of them, but you recognize that any individual in and of themselves can be a domestic terrorist without being a part of a group.
Exactly. the reason I point to the organizations and the groups is because there are 17 to 18,000 homicides every year. 40% almost go unsolved, right? That's far more unsolved by homicides than the 100 or so crimes that might happen that are related to what we call terrorism. So if we're trying to focus on reducing the impact of terrorism, understanding how the organized groups operate to perpetuate this violence is the key to working these groups in a way that will reduce the violence. Trying to imagine every single individual out there who might do something harmful and prevent it is not an effective strategy. Unfortunately, that's the one that we've been following with regard to a lot of these
Thank you.
acts. Thank you.
My time has expired, and I thank the chairman. Thank you.
I thank the ranking member. We made this agreement with Mr. Biggs and myself to clear up the record and for me to be able to have the opportunity to say what enormous appreciation this committee has for the time that these very excellent witnesses have spent answering the questions and concerns of members, because our challenge, of course, is to be legislators and to be able to speak the language that Congressman Correa said to those veterans who wore the uniform for this great country, that this nation is back. So let me say that if we had expanded the language of this title of this hearing, we might have said the rise of domestic terrorism in America that violently caused deaths of many people. I want to acknowledge, again, Officer Sicknick tragically lost his life out of the actions of January 6th. 2 other officers who we understand had committed suicide, and others who died on that day. They died. And so it is important to frame what we're doing here in the violence of the record of the Anti-Defamation League. 75% of all murders from domestic terrorism have been the result of right-wing extremists. Mr. No, would you give me the leaders of the Antifa movement? What are their names, please?
If you read any of my reports, you would know that there are no single leaders. They're organized into autonomous cells that are connected by networks.
Thank you very much, Mr. No. So in fact, as the FBI says, this is an ideology. These are ideologues. And you can evidence that in the actions that they promote across the nation. They show up and they do create havoc. And as one of our members indicated, though we all abhor violence, we recognize civil protests, but in the midst of civil liberties and civil rights. So I want to pose these questions to you gentlemen as we try to clear up the facts. First of all, one member was here today, we appreciate him, and he's trying to label the history of America in the context of Republicans and Democrats. White racism, white Nazism does not come in party affiliation. Let us put on the record that the freed slaves were Republicans because Abraham Lincoln freed them. As we went through, those who hung around to see Black people hung, I don't know their affiliation. They were white and they were filled with hatred. At the same time, he claims that they're Democrats. If they were, I find them abhorrent and will reject their behavior. And so we cannot put party labels, and I'm glad Mr. Biggs has extended his hand of friendship. Let's find a way to address this question because it is dastardly and ugly. So let me pose this question to you, Mr. German. Isn't it key that we understand Antifa is an ideology, but that out of white racism and white extremism comes death and violence in many instances? If you keep your answer short, I want to get to all of the gentlemen on this committee before I have to close. Mr. German.
Yes, exactly. What we need the FBI and the Department of Justice to do is focus on the white supremacist, far-right militant violence, actual violence that has happened, and recognize that the Capitol attack was not a standalone event. It was the culmination of many attacks before that.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Thank you for acknowledging H.R. 40 as also a reparative and restorative legislation that we filed time after time after time. Would you admit to the fact that from the perspective of hatefulness and actions, that African Americans, Black Americans have experienced violence throughout the 20th century, and that in addition to hangings that occurred in the early 1900s, we went into the civil rights movement and we had the Mississippi Boys, the Birmingham bombing. Those individuals, as we understand it, were white Southerners motivated by hatred and white racism. That is terror. That is now the modern terminology of alt-right. Would you say that that plays into why we have to address this question of domestic terrorism?
There's absolutely no question, Madam Chair, that you have described circumstances as they exist. The history of the African American experience in this country and in the 20th century underscores your point quite effectively. And in fact, later this year, we will celebrate the centennial or acknowledge the centennial anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, in which over 300 African Americans and the most prosperous business center of Black people in the country was destroyed a century ago this year.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And Mr. Nance, African Americans, Hispanic, Latinx, and now, of course, the community of Asian Americans, whether it is Sikh Indians or whether or not it's Asian Pacific or whether or not it's Southeast Asians, provoked by language but results in violent acts. And so how should this committee respond to finding a way besides the cultural changes of attitude, harmonious coming together, recognizing the unity of this nation, but how can we get to that core which winds up with people dying? That is why we had this hearing about the rise in domestic terrorism, because it is about people dying. That has to stop. How do we work that through the present laws and going forward?
Well, first off, as this hearing is very, very beneficial for the nation, is to understand that the very fact that there is a national threat, which is not just congealing from all of these small disparate groups, they are organizing themselves under a political ideology, and that ideology is intended to act as a political cudgel over the heads of all other peoples. You know, the very definition of terrorism is a threat or act of violence in which is political in nature, which uses terrorist tactics to influence an audience beyond the immediate victims. Well, you know, when you organize as military platoons and you're planning to intimidate a population by coming through with firearms, you know, you're not a terrorist until you use those firearms in a mass attack, as we saw with the representative from El Paso. That was a terrorist attack. Same thing with what we saw in Pittsburgh. So that being the case, we have to really go at this, as Mr. German said, you can't really tie ideology directly to it, but the actions and acts in the conspiracies of the individuals to see whether are they just people who are carrying out typical crimes, or are they part of a larger conspiracy intending to intimidate an entire nation or peoples?
I thank you so very much, and I thank the witnesses again for their patience and their excellent testimony and for accepting our invitation to be part of this hearing. I thank the members. We've had a very interesting hearing because we have mixed it with 3 hours of voting. And so I thank them for their indulgence, and we look forward to being proactive in legislating around these issues. Let me close the hearing in the names of Michael Fanone, Officer Michael Fanone of the Metro Police Department, Harry Dunn, Officer Glove, and many others, including the officer who testified yesterday in front of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, and all others who have fallen victim and fallen through the violence of hatred, white supremacy, white nationalism, and overall hatred. Let us, in this full committee and subcommittee, find a way to bring a solution that will heal this nation. This concludes today's hearing. Thank you to our distinguished witnesses for attending. As I said, thank you again for your patience. Thank the members again for their patience. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.